the end of history, or at least a totally new chapter of it had been reached. One of peaceful, democratic, and economic development for more or less everyone. Today we know better, have become realists again. Our globalized world, with its many new competitors, power centers, and challenges, has even become less stable. While the EU has not yet fully overcome the financial crisis, new threats are endangering it from its periphery. One is Russia and Ukraine, the Near and Middle East, terrorism, illegal immigration. Hundreds of thousands are flowing into Europe from the south and southeast. To mention only the major challenges. We are seeing the risk of a return of history, of notions like deterrence. Yes, we have to deter Putin again. Of containment. Yes, we have to contain Putin's Russia. Of spheres of influence. Yes, we have to avoid that Ukraine acts up totally or too much in Russian sphere. After all, it's the European people, Ukrainian people. There's the risk, or not only risk, probability that we too have to give great importance to the military again, including high military budgets. There's even a very pertinent observation I'm making here with regard to the German Bundeswehr, which once was a very effective army. It's still doing a good job in limited areas like Afghanistan or Kosovo, but on the whole, urgently needs reorganization and better, more modern equipment, and therefore probably, certainly in the middle term, more higher budget. This all comes upon us as a consequence of what Putin is trying to inflict on European countries. And that is regrettable because actually we have much more meaningful things to do. But we cannot merely follow wishful thinking and forget about the real world. And that is particularly difficult to accept for a country like mine, which carries so much historical baggage. In spite of our close ties, trading ties in particular with Russia, Germany under Angela Merkel, our Chancellor, has accepted the heavy burden in view of our strong linkage with the Russian economy. We have accepted the heavy burden of economic sanctions against Russia. And we are willing to shoulder more international responsibilities, some say even more in Germany. But while doing so, we will continue to try to help avoid that we all slide again into military confrontations. That, however, presupposes, requires for the EU, first of all, to bring our respective backyards in order. I already referred to the problem with our army, the Bundeswehr. We also need to implement long overdue structural reforms as a means for promoting investment, economic growth, and jobs in the member states, and that in a lasting way, and not by creating artificial firework through spending programs. We need to make the EU and its institutions more effective in all those areas in which the nation state today, acting on its own, has lost its capacity for solving the challenges of our times. And we also need, and with that I want to conclude, to revitalize the transatlantic partnership between the EU and the United States and Canada. The United States remains our indispensable main ally through NATO, as well as by way of the successful conclusion of the ongoing negotiations on TTIP, the investment and free trade agreement between the US and the EU. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lunkia, for having given some very thoughtful reflections. On the one hand, looking back, but on the other hand, looking forward in terms of also what can be learned from this significant day, and what do we need to do when it comes to not only German foreign policy, but also the European outlook. So we very much appreciate that. I would now like to welcome some brief comments from the other panelists, and hopefully start engaging the discussion with the audience, so really we can hear again, what are your questions, what are your comments. I'd like to begin by introducing the academic director of the Center for Culture and Diplomacy Studies, Professor Ulrich Bruckner. Professor Bruckner, I initially got to know when I was his student in the classroom way back when, and we had an excellent conversation, I remember then, about what opportunities there were to engage in culture diplomacy. And to make a long story short, ICD, we then developed, and step by step, we now have actually the academic field of cultural diplomacy, where he's also currently teaching as a member of our faculty, in addition to his overview as academic director. In addition to his responsibilities at ICD, Professor Bruckner is also the Jean Monnet Chair Professor of European Studies at Stanford University, which also has a campus here in Berlin. So Uli, I always introduce you in terms of the three passports that you have. On the one hand, the Bavarian, on the other hand, the German, on the other hand, the European. So maybe you could even reflect, given some of those passports, quote unquote, on the significance of this important day also for you in a number of angles. So let's give a brief welcome to also Professor Ulrich Bruckner.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the kind introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Instead of talking about me, I would rather like to talk about you. Who is from Germany? One. So, you're interested in cultural diplomacy, you're interested in international relations, and we provided this wonderful opportunity to listen to eyewitnesses and historical figures of German unification for a group of people who could be the children or grandchildren of us, except Mark. And you should think of it in terms of, why do I actually need to know this? What does it have to do with me? And I think the very simple answer to the question of what does it have to do with you is, you wouldn't be here without German unification. And it's not just a question of, now the city is united and it offers a lot of opportunities that makes Berlin so sexy and cool to come here to spend a few times of your academic career or what you do after your studies. But it's also an integral part of what Europe became. And what Ambassador von Kiau pointed out was that West Germany developed a new idea of what it wants to become after the end of the totalitarian system of the Nazi time. And this new identity of what West Germany tried to promote was the idea of, we want to become dependent on each other, and by becoming dependent on each other, we use economic means to integrate, to offer citizens a chance to do what you guys do, to come to places that either look more attractive or allow you to escape from conditions that are not as promising as they might seem in a city like Berlin in 2014. So on the one hand, it's historically interesting to listen how Germans reflect, or non-Germans reflect, on German unification, and to participate in something like this as if you watch the History Channel. But on the other hand, it is important to reflect the conditions of the life you live in. And that was also the idea in the speech of Ambassador von Kiau, to not only talk about the history, but also talk about where we are today and what are the conclusions to draw from events like this, where we step back and think of what happened to Germany and why did it become what it currently is. So that was my one food for thought, and I think at this point already there are a lot of questions waiting. We shouldn't let you wait for too long, although we still have more speakers to speak before we start with Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to now give a brief welcome to our special guest, who's actually come all the way from Scotland, but before that came all the way from Australia, as far as I know, Tasmania in particular. Professor Craig Mahoney. Professor Craig Mahoney is the principal of the University of West Scotland, and I think especially given the recent debates that have taken place in Scotland, but I think also given the interdependent role that I think Australia sees for itself today in terms of its foreign policy and engagement around the world, it would be very interesting to hear also your brief reflections and insights on the significance of 24 years of German reunification. So if we could please give a brief welcome to Professor Craig Mahoney.
Thank you, Mark. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I'll give you a little journey through history of my own experience of the reunification process and how I happen to be here today. I arrived in Berlin last night. I'm flying back to Scotland this evening. I've been in Berlin once before, in 1988. On my way, flying from the UK at the time, into Berlin, West Berlin, catching public transport across the city to get on a train on the east Berlin side to travel to Czechoslovakia. And the reason I did that was because I had a girlfriend who lived in Prague, and she was unable to leave Czechoslovakia. But I was able to relatively easily get into Czechoslovakia, and so I regularly, on a 4 and 6 week period, would travel into Prague, normally flying, but on this particular occasion I went by train. That's the last time I was here, so many of you weren't born in 1988, I don't imagine, and it looks considerably different than last time I was here. But as Mark said, my birthplace is actually Australia. I come from Tasmania, which is a very small island at the bottom of Australia. You may know it from Disney characters such as the Tasmanian devil that spins around on cartoons. It is a real animal, it doesn't actually do that. And it is under threat at the moment with a cancerous growth on its face, which is possibly going to make the entire population extinct. We hope that doesn't happen. I need to explain firstly that I'm the most inexperienced person on this platform to talk about this topic. I was born as a child, as we all were. I became a student. I subsequently did a degree and became a chemist. And subsequent to that, I became a psychologist. So I sit now here in the professional capacity as a psychologist, and you all should worry that I've been analysing you for the past hour. I'm joking. So cultural diplomacy is not my academic or professional area. However, I believe I have an opinion to express that's worth hearing. And I want to give you that firstly from my own experience living in Australia. Born in the 50s, I grew up in a post-war period. And war in Australia, the Second World War, meant many different things that did to European people. While Australian troops did fight in the European War, they also fought in the Japanese War. And the Japanese War, which was far closer to us, actually led to the invasion of Australia. The northern part of Australia was invaded by the Japanese. Sydney Harbour was infested with Japanese submarines. And there was an ever-present and real threat of what was referred to as the domino effect, where countries from Japan all the way down the peninsulas to the top of Australia would fall, and Australia would become ruled by the Japanese. So when I grew up as a child, my parents who'd grown through this were incredibly nervous and concerned about countries who delivered a communist or socialist regime. So despite the fact, I'm telling you this because despite the fact that I travelled to Europe when I was nearly 30, I was 29, I'd grown up with an extremely indoctrinated opinion of what socialism and communism meant. So back to my story about a girlfriend in Czechoslovakia. The first time I visited Czechoslovakia, I was 29, and I had an extremely extreme fear about what that would mean, because I've been brought up in an indoctrinated form about what socialism and communism were. Leaving that aside, back to Australia. Of course, post-Second World War, Australia was involved in two further quite significant wars during my early years. Firstly, the Korean War, and secondly, the Vietnam War. And in the case of the Vietnam War, both these countries, of course, were divided. Of course, in the Vietnam War, I was almost 18. And Australia operated, it doesn't now, but it operated its conscription processes, which is essentially a random lottery-type process by which males only at that stage were given a number, those numbers were withdrawn from the hat, if you like, and if you were unlucky enough, as it was transpired to be free leave, you would be conscripted into the Army, the Air Force or the Navy, and required to serve your time. And so my brother was 18, I was approaching 18, when, in my opinion, thankfully, the Vietnam War was ended for Australia's participation. Australia withdrew, and so I wasn't ever conscripted. Now, I have a lot of opinions about what I might have done if I'd been conscripted. That's an irrelevant argument here, but the point I'm trying to make is, in the same way that we've seen the reunification of Germany, we've seen Korea remain separated, we've seen Vietnam become reunified in a different form, of course, and of course there are many other examples. Subsequent to all that journey and my time having a girlfriend in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, and Prague is a city I love and I still visit many, many times, I went to live in Northern Ireland. I lived in Northern Ireland in 1988, the same year as I referred to my visit through Berlin. And Northern Ireland is not unlike what I'd experienced in Berlin. I came here, I saw a Berlin Wall, I saw a separation, I saw people on one side and people on the other side. I went to live in Belfast and I was there for 8 years, and unbelievably, there were Berlin walls everywhere. Those Berlin walls of separation in Belfast were dividing Protestants and Catholics, often the basis to many of the wars that have happened across the centuries. But I was astonished to see in a modern, developed Western economy, here I was experiencing exactly the same thing I'd seen in the separation of Germany, which I'd witnessed firsthand through Berlin. Now, I moved from Northern Ireland in 1995. I saw some of the worst atrocities. I visibly saw some of them in Northern Ireland during my time there. In fact, the day of my interview for a job, I saw in front of me a building blown up. I saw it, I was driving a hire car, I saw a building disintegrating in front of me as it was blown up. It was the largest bomb ever to be let off in Northern Ireland at the time. It was an astonishing, unbelievable set of circumstances. I lived there for 8 years, constantly in the company of people carrying machine guns, positioning themselves in ready-to-fire positions. You were walking through machine gun fire potential every day of your life when you lived in Northern Ireland. Roadblocks were everywhere. Security checks existed in all places. The city centres were closed at night, you weren't allowed into them. So I've lived and experienced some of the things that I heard some of my colleagues here who've experienced in a far more dramatic and far more brutal form than I have. And I, as a psychologist, what I did observe was the emotional behaviours of our two speakers, the President and the Ambassador, as they gave impassioned recollections of their experience of what war, what atrocity, what separation meant in their personal experience. And I found that very moving, and I hope you understood and you gained also some appreciation of the emotion which was coming from them. Just to summarise my journey, I'm a psychologist, as I said. I've mainly worked in the area of performance, a lot in sport. And sport for me is a unifying characteristic. When I was first in the UK and studying sport, one of the things that fascinated me was the success of the East Germans in sporting performances. In fact, historically now, if you still look at the data around Olympic medals, for example, gained in the relatively short period of time that East Germany existed, it is still ranked number 3 as the country most successfully acquiring Olympic medals. That's astonishing. Right, that's just East Germany alone. Now, sport for me is a phenomenal activity, but so too are what we refer to in the UK as the cultural industries. Whether that's performance in the form of music, which was mentioned earlier, drama, dance, sport, these things do unify people. And so while I'm an inexperienced individual to be able to talk about cultural diplomacy, I'm certainly very experienced to talk about the impact that the cultural industries have in bringing people together, in breaking down barriers, in making people feel harmony with what they do. So I sit with some pride here today, sitting in front of a young audience of individuals, students just like my students back in Scotland, where Malcolm and I work at the same university, have 16,000 students that we're in the care of the company of, educating these young people, giving them a chance through education to see life in a different way, to transform their lives. So my challenge to you, sitting out there now, knowing that you're all a lot younger than me, is that you have a life in front of you. And that life has got to be used effectively. The education that you're gaining here, the education you've gained previously, and the education that you'll continue to gain in your lifelong learning journey is about making a difference. And I'm now investing in you that responsibility to take that seriously and make that difference. Because the history of the past, the trauma that we've seen, the tragedy of war and conflict, I find absolutely abhorrent and unacceptable. And you must keep that ever present in your mind. There is a risk of that returning. And that was the recurrent message I picked up from the two speakers earlier, but I'm sure you understand that as well. But do not ignore it as someone else's responsibility. It is not. It is all our responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mooney, for excellent and very thought-provoking reflections. We would now like to turn, they say sometimes save the best for last, Professor Malcolm Foley. And the reason why I say the best in the sense is I think your country, being a Scot, almost actually separated from the United Kingdom. And I find it fascinating, here we are in Germany celebrating the reunification of two separate countries into one. At the same time, not only Scotland, but actually many other countries and regions of the world are seriously thinking about actually breaking away. So it really poses the question, do we live in an interdependent world where we're getting more and more interdependent? Or is this still this concept of independence where really everyone is trying to be on their own and to be free from the allegiances of the past or other allegiances? So I think it's really interesting to have you not only as the Vice Principal of the University of West Scotland and also the Academic Dean of the University of West Scotland, but also as a Scot to join us also on this discussion and to share with us your insights and your perspectives on the significance of 24 years of German reunification. So if we could please give a brief welcome to Professor Malcolm Foley.
Thank you, Mark. You wrote my script for me, so I can tear this one up and write a different one. I am a Scot. I was born in 1956, so I've witnessed many of the events, mostly through television, that we've heard of from my colleagues on the stage. Mark had asked me originally to reflect upon reunification. What he didn't say was reunification of Germany. I knew he meant reunification of Germany, but I liked the idea of the concept of just quite what was being reunified. My colleagues here have mentioned baggage, and Germany certainly carries a lot of 20th century baggage. I think if we go beyond back into the 19th and 18th century, the baggages become different. The demons perhaps become different. But to stick with reunification, governments serve people in my view of the world, not the other way around. People were reunified, families, communities, ideas, hopes, aspirations. And from the point of view of someone witnessing your moment of reunification with the fall of the Berlin Wall, well, it's not you, is it? Because there's only one German. But the reunification of Germany then, through the medium of television, it was clear that something more than just German was happening. And it was, for me, about a common European identity. So let me digress briefly into a family moment. My grandfather was born in the very early 20th century. By the time I was born in 1956, he was an important influence in my life, and he saw Germany as something to fear. He saw the division of Germany as a convenient way of ensuring that he would not, in his life, he hoped, live through another world war. Now, I think he was naive, but those would have been his simple thoughts as a coal miner. My youngest son is 10 years old this year. He came to Germany, to Berlin with me in May when we visited Mark. He's very interested in football, as many 10-year-old boys are. And I'm significantly well enough off to be able to say I can afford to buy 2 football shirts for you, but no more than 2. He would like many more than 2. Where does he choose? He's 10 years old, he plays football. Before the World Cup, incidentally, he doesn't choose Chelsea, Manchester United, no, Manchester City, no. He chooses Germany, Philip Lamb, name on the back, and he chooses Bayern Munich. Sorry, but Bayern Munich. Bayern Munich with Bastian Schweinsteiger. That's a lot of letters, and it's €1 per letter, actually. So Philip Lamb was a lot cheaper than Bastian Schweinsteiger. But, so to 10-year-old boys in Scotland, Germany is cool. German football is a big part of your cultural diplomacy, as are the economically powerful brands like BMW or Adidas and so on. These are cool, and that matters a lot for cultural diplomacy. Let me respond to Mark's point about Scotland. So I hope many of you know that in Scotland recently we had a 2.5-year debate around whether or not we should separate from the United Kingdom, separate from England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the vote in the end was very, very high turnout. Over 90% of those eligible to vote actually voted. That's almost unprecedented in a Western democracy, where we have turnouts of perhaps 40 or 50% in elections. So it gives a lot of legitimacy to the result. Of course, 54%, I think, of those who voted no. In other words, we want to stay Scots, and 46% voted yes. If you add the 10% who didn't vote, of course, neither side completely convinced a majority of the electorate that Scotland should either be independent or not independent. So you're asking yourself, what did I vote? So I'll tell you, I voted no. I voted to stay. Well, technically my vote was to stay in the United Kingdom, but that wasn't necessarily the reason I and many people whom I know voted no. They voted no because there was no convincing argument that Scotland would be able to stay in Europe, in administrative Europe, at the moment that it became independent. We would have to get to the back of the line behind many other very legitimate claimants to European identity. And so for me, being a European is almost, I think possibly almost as important as being Scottish. I regard myself as being part of an independent country, and that independent country is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I know that Scots are believed to be commonly at war regularly in their minds with the English, and that is a two-dimensional stereotype. Of course, we all have many friends across these borders. These are not the kind of borders that your parents, our generation up here, apart from Mark, experienced in Europe. And hearing the very eloquent pieces that I've heard from the stage, what inspires me here is that I'm sitting among people who have lived it, and I'm sitting among you who are far closer to real conflict in somewhere like Ukraine than I have the comfort of experiencing in distant Scotland. So like Craig, I urge you not to become too complacent in the nation that you have. I'm not a big fan of nation states, but if we're going to have them, I think I would rather they existed with a free press, with freedom of movement, with a democratic consensus, rather than what represents the alternative. I don't think Putin is a dictator to all intents and purposes. I don't even think he's a dictator with a human face. So I think there are some real challenges for those of you who are living in the neighbourhood of the next potential European conflict. And I strongly believe that cultural diplomacy and soft power are the answer to ensuring that my 10-year-old ends up having the same opportunities as you have, and your children will have these opportunities too. So I urge you, don't become complacent, never stop struggling. It doesn't have to be war or strife. There are plenty other cultural and economic struggles to continue, and I urge you to keep struggling.
Thank you
you very much. I think that's also a perfect transition to actually your interactions, your questions, and your comments. So let's keep struggling together as a group with, I think, a very significant moment in history for all of us. And I'd be very happy now to immediately take your questions and your comments. As always, at ICD, I'd ask you to please raise your hand if you'd like to say something, and then briefly introduce yourself, in particular where you're from, just so we can really get a taste for the vast diversity that's in this room. And that's yours. And so let's take maybe 3 or 4 comments, questions from the audience at least, and then we can give it back to the panel. But I want to make sure what we're talking about is also what you want to talk about. So please, ask us your questions, give us your comments. Hopefully we don't agree on all these issues. We can have a discussion, a debate. I see one hand already in the front, and then one off to the side. Once again, if you please introduce yourself too.
I'm Dimitri. I'm an intern here at the ICD. I'm from Belgium. I have a question for the minister of the left. You recently just said that you believe that cultural diplomacy and soft power is the future roles to play. But I was wondering, for example, in the struggle against ISIL, how do you see the role for cultural diplomacy there? Do you think we should? What is the limits of cultural diplomacy?
And let's take maybe a few questions together, also because we're limited to one wireless mic. So let's go to the side. And then,
I have a question to Ambassador Kio.
where are you from, also?
My name is Leo. I'm from Ukraine, originally, actually. Well, he provided quite one-sided narrative of the Cold War, which I do not agree with. I think even most scholars would agree that the Soviet Union was the more defensive power, while the United States were more aggressive and offensive in their endeavors of deterrence. Further, you said that the West has to keep Ukraine out of the Russian sphere. I wonder, how do you want to do that? Germany, a few days ago, gave 500 million euro to Ukraine to rebuild the Donbas region. There's just enough money, there's not even enough money to rebuild one big factory in the Donbas region. To recover Ukraine's economy, you need at least 100 billion. Is the European Union willing to give 100 billion to Ukraine? How do you want to keep Ukraine out of the Russian sphere?
Excellent question. Let's continue.
Thank you very much, Leo. You stole my question. Anyway, I am Jacopo and I'm from Italy, but I have a family that is spread a little bit all over Europe. Especially I have an uncle that is living in Belgium, in Eupen. Therefore, he's a German speaker. And just last week, when I was at his home, he told me, my nephew, I can assure you that you cannot imagine how glad I am that I have survived the DDR. For he was very hostile to East Germany. And he was very hostile to the Soviet war in general. He is now 80 years old. He just turned 80. So he lived through the war and through the Cold War after that. My question was related to that, Leo, and very similar also to the other one, but not concerning ISIL, but specifically concerning the possible beginning of a new Cold War. What can cultural diplomacy do? What can cultural diplomacy achieve in order to avoid the beginning of a new Cold War? Thank you.
Excellent. Are there 1 or 2 others before we give it back to the panel? Comments, questions, again in the back.
I'm Alex, I'm from the UK. There's a few mentions about soft power. An argument that I've become aware of is that maybe in recent decades the idea of soft power being an effective tool towards influencing kind of peace in the international system might, as we see recent developments in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, might actually have failed. And whether perhaps you can't have like the legitimacy of soft power can't be had without an element of hard power, and that in fact a hard power is still incredibly significant, especially in a more increasingly unstable world we see today. So just like to get your thoughts on that as well.
Excellent. Is there another comment or question? Oh, yes.
Hello, I'm Christoph from Poland. I have two simple questions about European Union. First, you mentioned that the European Union should be more effective in all fields. So my simple question first is, do you have a solution how to solve this problem? And the second, if you because there is a war in, for example, Syria, and there are a lot of illegal immigrants here in Europe. And my question is about these illegal immigrants, how to protect them against these illegal immigrants, how to help to find them in Poland, not in Poland, but in Europe. There is a simple solution how to solve this problem with the immigrants. Thank you.
I think we have a lot of stuff for discussion. Let's maybe come back to the panel, a few responses, and then we can do hopefully a second round also. Who would like to intervene first? There were some questions directed, I think, specifically Ambassador Munkia. Raise your hand if you want.
Well, there are quite a few intriguing questions. I certainly think that cultural diplomacy in the present situation in which we find ourselves can and could be helpful, but will not be enough. I never considered the United States, generally speaking, as aggressive. In some instances, maybe they were, but on the whole not. In relationship certainly with the Soviet Union after 1945, the United States responded. Whether they always took wise decisions in that response is another question. But certainly they responded to Soviet pressure and the Soviet determination under Stalin to maintain a strong grip on all the countries the Red Army had occupied, and even going beyond that limit with regard, let's say, to Berlin, with regard to Eastern Germany, with regard to also Greece, etc. So there was a real threat, and we had to counter that. And we did it by containment and deterrence. And that is not aggressive tool of warmongering and war making, but simply of showing to the other side that there's a limit, that if they would go beyond that limit in risk-taking, they could start a world war. And it worked. That's to the credit, if you want to, even of the Soviet Union, that their leaders at that time decided that they should avoid the ultimate risk. And so we had a stalemate between the two systems, and on that basis, we were capable to develop, in the famous Hamel report of NATO in the 70s, a policy that not only was based on deterrence, but also on dialogue, on efforts towards detente. And this is something which basically we probably need today again in assuring the independence of Ukraine. From my point of view, that is what counts, to allow Ukraine in freedom and independence to decide about its own fate, and not by imposing anything on them from either side. Now, we have to help the Ukraine, yes, but there are limits, not only financial limits. Militarily, we cannot help. We can maybe give them some money so that they can buy some military equipment, but even that is it's something one has to seriously think about. I mean, the trouble is, we are all declaring war is not a way of solving the Ukrainian crisis, and that is correct. That's the position of the whole West. But for Putin, this is not valid. He uses military force. So what are we going to do? We are vexed in this situation, and the poor Ukrainians are left largely to themselves, and therefore we have to do as much as we can. And also, that's why we decided on the economic sanctions. It's not very fun for us. We are deeply interwoven with the Russian economy and helping them by selling machine tools, etc. But we had no choice, because since we cannot use military force, we have to use at least this weapon to make Russia and Putin feel that he too, that Russia too, has to pay a price. Now, whether this is going to work, I don't know. Whether this is going to safeguard the independence of Ukraine, I don't know. Ukraine will have to make a major effort of its own. Ukraine is primarily responsible for its fate, and we can only help bring about framework conditions that might allow Ukrainians to decide in freedom and independence. And we will do our best, short of war, of course. And that's all I can say about the Ukraine situation. Soft power is positive. The EU has mainly soft power, but nowadays soft power has two elements which are very effective. One is economic strength. And it's what counts to be. It's the economy. It's what brought the Soviet Union down, the wrong economic system. So the economy is what counts. It's the economy stupid, as one American president for domestic purposes, however, said. And so this we have, and this is an element of soft power. We have also another element of soft power, which at the time of European, not German, European reunification was very important. It's the power of values. And we, with all our shortcomings in the West, we are standing, and in particular also in Western Europe, as the EU for our values, our common democratic values. And these values have also proved, together with the economic aspect, that we brought about the downfall of the Soviet system, of the oppression of that system, the oppressive side of it. And now soft power still works, except you cannot neglect that military power as a very last resort might remain, and will probably even remain, necessary, not to wage war, but to distract the other side from daring the war. The only dictators, authoritarian leaders, we have learned that from Hitler, from Stalin, from Milosevic, they can only be deterred through strength. This is why Russia, under the Stalinistic approach, Russia in the end failed, because the West stood up. The West didn't stand up to Hitler. As a German, I'm not supposed to blame the West for this, but this was the result. Chamberlain, etc. They meant well, but they were misused, exploited by Hitler. So this is the lesson we learned there. And with Milosevic, we waited far too long. We could have solved the problem with lesser victims if we had decided to even use some military force. It would not have been necessary to do much. But the Americans didn't want to. The Germans always are against it because we have our past. We are always peaceful, and we always love soft power. We are always ready even to use economic sanctions. No, it hurts us, but that's still soft power. So we are the real military as the last resort. Effective Europe, yes. We need, effective means that the institutions, the Commission, the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice, the Council meetings, all are effective. It means, first of all, we need to set them with people. That's not always clear, whether we set our best people. We have, fortunately, now one of our very best, Jean-Claude Juncker as Commission President. We have also a very good President of the European Council, the former Polish Prime Minister Tusk. So we are trying to improve, but we still have a lot to do in order to recognize the importance of the European level. There are more laws now made in think that the greatest goal is to become a politician at national level. No, the greatest. If I had a new life, I would always go to Europe and to Brussels institutions and no longer to I would no longer join the foreign ministry of my country. I would go to Brussels because I know the future is there and not the national government, at least not as far as the big issues are concerned. Now, effective Europe means qualified majority decisions and not unanimity and fudging at the lowest common denominator on the issues. This is unfortunately not easy to, it's theoretically wonderful, but unfortunately we have now this European Council, a French idea, and we are suffering from it because they always sit on top, the heads of state and government, love it in the midst of all kinds of journalists admiring them and reporting. And, sorry, I'm getting excited always about Europe, you know, that's my problem. And they are handling everything now, the heads of state and government. But they do it on the basis of unanimity. 28 member states have to agree to any policy decision. This is the return of a Europe as we had it already in the time of the Vienna Congress. So we have to give more power back to the Ministerial Council, which can decide by qualified majority. That is a question of political will. And maybe after we have solved the financial crisis, we could return to that. And that would give more efficiency. Also in dealing, my last point, with illegal immigrants. This is very complicated. On the one hand, we have to give asylum and be ready to receive those who are victimized in other parts like Syria and Iraq, Kurds, etc. On the other hand, the more we let all these streams of immigrants come in, the more we run the risk of feeding righteous anti-foreign parties in all kinds of member states of the European Union, including now even in Germany, but mainly until now in France, in Britain, but also in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Sweden, but now also in Germany. And this is a very risky thing because these righteous are not only xenophobic against foreigners, they are also against Europe. And there is brewing up something which is not only disgusting, it is very dangerous for all parts of you. And therefore we have to be very careful. On the other hand, we cannot deny asylum to those who are in need. My point is you need, and that I know is not a totally convincing answer, but we need to do more to keep people where they come from. That is, we must try not to wait until the war becomes widespread in order to bring peace to regions of difficulty. So the question whether we allow the Syrian situation to deteriorate for too long is one which should primarily be directed to the President of the United States, who now has to intervene. If he had intervened a year ago, who knows, when he had established his red line in Syria, who knows whether we would not have been all better off. But I can't make this final judgments. I only say this is one way of coping with these kind of situations as soon as possible. The other is, a lot of those who come are not only coming because of war situations, they also come for economic reasons. And so we have to bring more economic development and good governance into these countries from where they come. Towards us in Africa in particular, northern but also in southern Africa and the whole African continent. And this is the thing which we are striving at since many years, but with not sufficient results. I think we have to create jobs where these people are, these many young people. unfortunately, we have also to do within the European Union. So we are really busy in all regards. But if you don't create jobs there, in the country of departure, they will all come. It is very simple. We have to do something to create jobs where these people are escaping from in order to have a better future. And when you do that, you have, of course, also to see to it that the products that are produced in, let's say in this case in Africa, can be sold. So it's no use to give them money to build a factory and then sell to the products, but that creates problems for our own workers, protectionism, only quotas, is not enough. This is one of the reasons why the Barcelona process to develop Northern Africa never worked. There are other reasons for it, but it never worked because on Mediterranean products, certain southern European member states were protectionists. They were willing to spend our money where, let's say in Algeria or Morocco or where, in Tunisia, and then when it came to allowing the products, it said, take you, Germans, take the products, but we only quotas because it is too problematic. Now, I can't blame them for political reasons, we are all egoistic, but on the, you must find a better compromise. It's no use spending money now yonder, there, and not in Australia, I mean in Africa, and then not take their products. This again is also a problem of commercialization. It's you need infrastructure. It's a huge thing, but we have to develop an all-comprehensive approach to these problems. And it's not only a question of taking more and more illegal or even legal immigrants in. We also have to think about the future these people need in their own countries. And this is a general approach. It goes far beyond Germany, far beyond the European Union. It's a UN problem, but somebody has to go and take the first step. And I see no reason why the EU should not take a leadership position in this regard.
Thank you very much for responding to most of the questions. Additional comments or perspectives? Who'd like to go next? Professor Foley, could you hand that back to us?
I think most of the questions had a response there. What reassured me was that the preparedness from the floor to challenge what we're saying, and that I think that is excellent and very encouraging. Let me say a couple of things as a sociologist, because I think you are here for an academic course of study as well as an understanding of the pragmatic and political situations in which your academic endeavours are located. So most theories of power, sociologically, assume that any power is backed up by force in the end. So whatever you can make happen, happens in the end because there is a police, a military, or whatever behind it. It doesn't always need to be used. So I sensed a certain despondency in some of the questioning about soft power. What I would say is, I don't think anyone up here is suggesting that it's the only tool in the toolbox. It is one tool. It is one tool that many who come from a rational, academic and reflective position are prepared to attempt to use. Theories of power generally argue that power comes in three major formats. The power to permit, to let things happen. The power to prevent, to stop things happening. But possibly most importantly for soft power, the power to set the agenda, to decide what things are to be important for discussion, and perhaps more importantly, what things never get discussed, never reach the agenda. And I think what lay behind Leo's question to us was that we inhabit a particular element of that agenda, and they're called hegemonies sociologically. And Leo, frankly, you inhabit another. They are competing, they are possible, they're not irreconcilable, but at the level of hegemonies, they represent challenges. And our respective media, whether in the former Soviet Union or in the former West, perpetuate, and possibly still perpetuate, some of those hegemonies, and that soft power to be lived. The only question my friend here, I think, didn't directly address was Dimitri's question about ISIS, if I'm not mistaken. I think it would be only good manners to attempt some kind of response. ISIS is a very difficult set of territories. I see ISIS as a clear example of the failure of hard power. Now you might find that ironic, but ISIS is, I suggest to you, directly correlated to the policies of Tony Blair in the UK government and his counterparts in the United States of America. And of course ISIS actually are far smarter than some of our media are willing to portray them, because they are using hard power, but they wouldn't be getting very much traction if they weren't also winning over hearts and minds with their ideas, with their cultural imperatives, and the narrative around what it was that, crudely, the West did to certain parts of the Middle East. Crucially, they're very much more difficult to deal with in a soft power arena because they are not a nation state. And I think I said when I spoke that I'm a little bit suspicious of the idea of the nation state. And I think we should watch ISIS carefully, because the concept of a caliphate, for example, or something similar from a different cultural agenda could potentially, not immediately, but potentially supersede the idea of a nation state. But I would say make no mistake, I see that as ISIS are soft power backed up by hard power, very obviously, and they are a response to the failure of hard power on the part of the West.
Well, thank you very much. President Constantinescu?
For a peaceful and democratic world, we need to have both hard power and soft power. We need to have both classical diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. Remember the experience, hard experience of first and second part of 20th century. In the second part of 20th century, after the end of the Second World War, military power of United States protected Western democracy and don't permit the Soviet Union to transform the Cold War in a hot war. But consequences of this kind of politics was limited to frozen conflict, but do not resolve this. Only soft power of intellectual elite from Central and Eastern communist countries provoked, and peoples from Central and Southeastern Europe provoked the peaceful fall of communist dictatorship regime, with exception, regrettable exception of bloody repressive communist regime in Romania in December 1989. Now is the same situation. Only military force of NATO can stop aggressive comportment of Russia or criminal action of Islamic State. Classical diplomacy is necessary for limit civil war in Ukraine and in Middle East. But for a sustainable peace, we need more. We need to build a culture of peace based on cultural diplomacy. Why? Because cultural diplomacy is based on principle understanding the others. We need to create a long confidence, not only between governments, but especially between peoples and different nations. Culture of peace is a long process. It's a long way to deeper. Why? Because we have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years of humankind history. We have a culture of wars. All heroes is Lord of War, is not Lord of Peace. Why? Because we need step-by-step understanding. It's necessary to change mentalities. It's very difficult. I know very well because in the last 25 years after the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, more difficult, but more easy to create laws, to create institutions, but it's more difficult to change mentalities. It was more easy to create democratic institutions, but it's extremely difficult to create democratic conscience. If only democratic conscience can stop the war. And my all hopes, I'm old, my hope is in young generation. Because young generation can create a real democratic conscience, understanding enlargement of democracy, representing enlargement of peace. Because it's more difficult in democratic system to declare war, like in authoritarian or dictatorship regime, or in facade democracy, like in Soviet Union. I repeat, it's a long, long way to keep it. It's very difficult to build cultural diplomacy, to build a new democratic conscience. We need a peace, because only in peace we can build a new democratic conscience, a new type of moral market economy. Is your task, and I'm confident in the young generation.
Thank you very much. Professor Mahoney.
Again, as I said before, I'm not necessarily skilled to make informed comments as my colleagues have, but the one I would pick up on is immigration. It's curious to me that immigration continues to be a problem. We live in a very modern global world. We can access technology, as I'm sure many of you have, and I hope you are. I've tweeted myself this morning. I couldn't find a Twitter handle for the organisation, but we'll chat later. Technology connects us to the world, yet we still have issues around country borders. I was astonished last night when I flew into Berlin that my passport wasn't checked. I don't have a problem with that, but my passport wasn't checked. I got off a plane, albeit I flew from another European nation. I flew from Holland. But I got to Germany and I was able to walk merely through and out to be collected by Mark in the Gapa. Even in Amsterdam, flying from Scotland yesterday, I had my passport checked when moving from one part of the terminal to another part of the terminal. To some curiosity to the young lady looking at my passport. I come from a continent country. Australia's border controls are extremely stringent. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but they are extremely stringent. If you've ever travelled to Australia, you will have had to go through quite a bit of visa control systems before you got anywhere near being allowed on a plane or a boat to go to Australia. And once there, you can still find yourself rejected and turned back before being allowed to enter the country. In a previous life, when I was married, my wife had no right of entry into Australia, even though she was my wife and I'm an Australian passport and citizen holder. So I'm curious why, in a world which is modern, the variation on passport control, and therefore visa entry, and therefore immigration, varies hugely across the world. It always astonishes me. As an Australian passport holder, there are many countries I can't go to without a visa. Malcolm, on the other hand, travelling on a British passport, can go to many countries with great ease. I do aspire to having a British passport. I do not aspire, apologies for the British citizens in the audience, I do not aspire to being a British citizen. That's a separate entity. But clearly there are immigration issues, and we had this discussion in a pre-meeting upstairs earlier. The UK remains very attractive for a lot of people throughout the world because it's perceived to be a wealthy nation with huge opportunities. And if you have ever studied as an international student in the UK, by international I mean non-European international, you will have found the process in recent years of getting a student visa to study in the UK very stringent. The reasons for that were because the study in the UK as a non-European citizen costs around £9,000 to £10,000 of fees, so around 15,000 to 16,000 euros per year. And that's the same price, approximately the same price, as it will cost you to enter the UK illegally in a container or some other life-threatening process. So until about 4 years ago, there were people entering the UK on student visas and disappearing into what's called the grey or black economy. And they did that because they weren't linked to a university. Universities were not required to track them down or establish that they were actually studying in the program. Now, the laws have changed in recent years in the UK. They've created enormous strains on the university system, but still there are huge problems. Now, I'm off on a tangent partly, but I suppose what I'm saying here is there are serious and large-scale implications for operating in a one world where everybody should be seen as being equal and given the same sort of opportunities, with how immigration prevents that, and all sorts of other discriminative practices are also in place to defy and restrict people having free movement. I appreciate, of course, there are some people we may not want to have free movement, who are proven criminals or who are terrorists or who are known to be concerns to individual regimes. But at the moment there's a huge amount of unfairness, as far as I can tell, in the world, which as far as I can see is a very small place, And you as young citizens, I'm sure, have travelled to many countries, you've travelled to many more countries in the remainder of your lives, much more than your parents would probably have done, certainly the generations before that. So this is a problem which is, on many levels, one urgent in need of its resolution.
The privilege of being the last speakers of 5 in the first Q&A session is that one can reflect on the reflections. And what you said about entering Germany without getting your passport checked, this was not just luck or by accident. This is exactly what Dietrich von Kia was referring to when he said, we live in times in which this can be described as the end of sovereignty. The idea that one nation state can run its own business is so 19th century that we should really face the changing world and all the opportunities that it comes with. So the European consequence of this is Schengen, and we trust the Dutch. And we do it in various other forms, and that's the idea of creating institutions that make it practically possible what Dietrich von Kia described as his new life that he would lead as one architect of an ever closer European integration reality, which is not just an idea, but it is something that makes your life better and uses the opportunities of this continent, which is my answer to the question about how can we make the European Union more effective. In our conversation upstairs in Mark's office, I received a very nice compliment that I sound too intellectual today, which is perfect if we have a panel discussion, which is kind of a role play, and my role is to be the intellectual today. So reflecting from the intellectual point of view on some of the things, I'm not a promoter of this is the one answer to how we could make the European Union more effective. My role is to look into the existing models of what we can do and to inform the citizens what the costs and the benefits of different opportunities are. No matter if we talk about the whole thing or whether we talk about very particular cases like would it be better for Scotland to be independent and then having a hard time getting back into the European Union, or would the costs be higher staying in the United Kingdom and playing this folkloristic play of we are so discriminated and we don't have our autonomy, and look how else the different promoters of the two sides sold their idea. So this is up to the demos to decide which option is the better one, and you showed in a very practical example what democracy means in executing the will of the people in a free choice. So that would be my answer to the EU effectiveness question, that all the models are there, and we only have to look into what are the intended and the unintended consequences of the different options. It doesn't lead to anything if we would think, well, we have the recipe that works everywhere, like Germany benefited from a federalized system after experiencing a very centralized totalitarian regime, and now the rest of the world should learn from the German federal model that we managed to balance the interests of the parts and the interests of Germany as a nation state. This worked well in the context of Germany, which is a very cultural question, because all the models are only as good as the cultural context allows them to be. And if we would export the German model elsewhere, it would be maybe a big failure because we ignore the cultural conditions. So who am I to tell someone who comes from a totally different background, set of priorities, that this is the ultimate solution for making the European Union more effective, for finding a solution for an autonomous region, or what other problems we are confronted with where political science should give advice. Another question about the role of cultural diplomacy, that was already mentioned. It's a tool in the toolbox. So one could phrase it as it's a necessary precondition to fix problems, but in many ways it's not sufficient. And in your distinction of the sociological theories that talk about power, I had an interesting case to apply the different forms that power to enforce, power to prevent, and power to set the agenda on a discussion that we had after a presentation of Anna, who sits in the back, who gave a talk on Germany in the European Union and the role of Germany from the perspective of anyone else but Germans in my European politics class at New York University in Berlin. And what we tried to find out was the question of why is Germany perceived as the leader, as the power center of the European Union, which was not designed to be led by single countries. Instead, everything Dietrich von Kiau managed to achieve at the time when he represented Germany's interest in Brussels as the watchdog of German interests in this stereotypical definition of what ambassadors should do. Everything he managed to achieve there was only possible if he took care of the interests not only of the other big ones, but particularly of the little ones, which also played a role in what we celebrate here today, that the 4+2 talks that managed to get Germany united as a more the management side of this, and not only the demonstrations that helped to open the wall. This was only possible in the framework of the European Union in which the little ones had a say. The first response of Genscher, when the Netherlands, for example, asked to have a say, was, you guys are not part of the play, which was technically right. 4+2 did not include Italy or the Netherlands or anything, but it was possible for the others to have a say, especially, and that's an interesting comparison with what would have happened if Scotland would have voted yes. How to integrate something into the European Union, because something in the case of German unification was an 8-month procedure to include the former GDR into the European community at that time, because we were still in this phase of discussing the transformation of European community into the European Union at that time, which was much, much faster under conditions in which everyone wanted this. So if it's wanted, it's not much of a deal. While in your case, one could guess who would likely to set the agenda differently, no matter if it's backed up or not. So I'm still puzzled with the question of what makes Germany a power center of the European Union, at least in the perception, because according to Malcolm's definition, it's not really backed up with power. We don't send the cavalry, although sometimes rhetorically people refer to this if they have nothing else to say as an argument. And the sheer size of the GDP doesn't impress others too. Institutionally, we don't have a privileged position, so the only thing we can do is to send people who care for the interests of the others and learn that a German interest must include interests of those who are intentionally or unintentionally affected by what Germany is promoting. And if this promotion is a solution that is acceptable for others, we can set the agenda and appear as a power center. Anything else, like bullying others or throwing money at problems, simply doesn't work because we don't have the means. And still, if you ask anyone how the European Union functions, people would refer to, well, there is something about Germany involved, which is a big oversimplification if we look at how the whole thing actually works. I think that should be it for this one.
Yeah,